Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to this week's webcast with Schiller Institute founder Helga Zepp LaRouche. When we initiated this weekly webcast, our intention was to bring the spirit of the New Silk Road to a broader audience. This was necessary in part because this was not getting any legitimate coverage. It was either being blacked out or lied about in the mainstream media. But it was also beyond that to give you an opportunity to get into the insights of Mrs. LaRouche, who along with her husband Lyndon was one of the instigators of the idea that's become the new paradigm represented by the New Silk Road. Now, in the last weeks, we had a major emphasis on the importance of President Trump's trip to China and Asia. And we're seeing a continued flurry of diplomatic activity. So I'd like to start with what just happened in the last few days, the visit of President Assad of Syria to Sochi to meet with President Putin, a summit following that with Erdogan and Rouhani and Putin, and then also the phone call between President Trump and President Putin. So Helga, go ahead and give us some insights into what's going on.
Well, I must say that this visit of President Assad in Sochi, where he met not only with Putin, but with the major Russian military leadership, is really a historic event. Because if you remember, a little bit more than 2 years ago, when Putin decided to militarily intervene in Syria, the situation in that country was completely hopeless. You had ISIS terrorists, Al-Qaeda, and various other groupings, which were in large part the result of the failed policies of the Obama administration and others, naturally the British. And the situation was really, truly, absolutely desperate. And with a very bold initiative, Putin militarily intervened. And now, 2 years later, they could basically celebrate victory. Putin said that the ISIS terrorists are as good as totally failed, that there may be pockets flaring up here and there, but nothing dramatic, just as part of the terrorism which internationally naturally still exists. But this was a very moving thing. President Assad thanked the Russian military. Putin introduced him to them by saying, I want you to meet the people who saved the Syrian people, the Syrian country. And Assad expressed his profound gratitude and said they will never forget. Now, you can imagine the Western media, they naturally don't say it's wonderful that the Syrian people now have peace. It's wonderful that the refugees can now return, which is what Assad basically said should happen. No, they just keep their grudging slanders against both Putin and Assad. But I want our viewers to reflect about this for a minute. What do you prefer? Do you prefer wars based on lies, interventionist wars, which have thrown the whole Southwest Asia into complete chaos, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Northern Africa, or are you not happy that peace can return? And Putin is now continuing this. He met the next day, as you said, with President Erdogan and President Rouhani of Turkey and Iran. And he announced that there will be a Syrian national coalition dialogue, which he will conduct in Sochi, where all parties of Syria will be invited, and that it will be the result of the will of the Syrian people themselves how to decide their own future. But that obviously other countries should help in the reconstruction of the economy, the infrastructure, the agriculture, hospitals, schools. So I think this is really a very dramatic change for the better in the situation. And it shows very clearly that Russia is not the aggressive warmonger and aggressor, which is how it is portrayed by the Western media. But Putin has brought peace, and I really want to say this very strongly, because the propaganda against Russia has been so absolutely incredible that people have stopped to look at things and appreciate them when they happen. And I think this is a very important process. Putin has involved a very large diplomatic initiative in the Astana process. He involves other countries like Jordan, even reaching out to Saudi Arabia. And obviously the role of Turkey and Iran in bringing about this peace in Syria is very important. So hopefully this will lead to a stabilization also of the remaining crisis points like Yemen. And, I think this is a very, very positive development. And I think people should really, not be blinded by ideology, but understand that this is part of the paradigm shift. Because, China and Russia are working very closely. China will play a role in the reconstruction of Syria. China just sent 1,000 tons of rice to the Syrian people to help overcoming shortages. So I think this is all part of a new spirit of countries working together for the common good.
And one of the people who definitely seems to appreciate what the Russians are doing, President Trump, who had a longer talk with President Putin on the phone the other day and talked about U.S. involvement in this process. So I think that's something that indicates that it's, in spite of the media, the president is still going ahead with his plan to cooperate with Russia.
Trump afterwards said the discussion was great. It covered the Syria situation, North Korea, Ukraine, and that they had a very profound dialogue. And the same thing was emphasized by the Russian side, where several spokespersons of the Duma and the Federation Council basically expressed great optimism and hope that now the Russia-American relation would turn in a better direction. And again, who would not be happy that the most important countries, the US and China, the US and Russia, are starting to have a cooperative approach. Anybody who opposes that is either a moron or morally depraved. There is no way how you can otherwise characterize such people.
Well, just to identify one of those types, David Ignatius of the Washington Post wrote a column, I think yesterday, in which he said, "Why hasn't Rex Tillerson left? He and Trump don't get along. There are only two things they agree on. One is cooperation with China on North Korea and trade, and the other is cooperation with Russia on Syria." So my response to that is, well, what's wrong with that? That's the way things should go. Now, in light of this, we also see quite a bit of additional diplomatic activity with the Japanese being involved, a trip by the Panamanian president to China. Give us a sense, Helga, of the broad scope of this motion right now.
Well, the new Silk Road Initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been put on the agenda by Xi Jinping more than 4 years ago, and which sort of had a long process of building, involving more and more countries. First the G20, then the BRICS, the SCO, all these organizations participating in one sense or another in this process, and then culminating in the Belt and Road Forum in May, and now finally in the 19th National Congress of the Communist Party of China, which laid out a beautiful perspective how the world should come together in a peaceful way until the year 2050. Now that dynamic is the dominant dynamic in the world, and contrary to what Western media are saying, Prime Minister Abe of Japan is clearly seeking to improve very, very massively the relationship with Russia. He has stated again that Japan will try to have a deeper, better relation to solve the problem of the Northern Islands, and also get a peace treaty between Japan and Russia, which I think is a very laudable effort. But also Japan is moving closer to China. They probably will join the AIIB fairly soon. They already are cooperating with the Belt and Road Initiative. And the president of Panama had, Panama, which used to be one of the countries recognizing Taiwan and not the mainland People's Republic of China, they recently switched that alliance, and the president of Panama visited China in a state visit and said that the collaboration between Panama and China is just the tip of the iceberg, that the entire Latin American continent will follow, and that it is not directed against the United States, but the United States are invited to join the same kind of cooperation. So I think there is clearly a strategic realignment going on, which is very, very positive. And just to mention it, one after effect of Trump's visit to China, I watched the press conference of the governor of West Virginia, Jim Justice, who announced to the media the positive effects of the $83.7 billion of economic deals Trump brought back from his trip for West Virginia. And he said, look, this means jobs, this means hope, it means processed production, not just raw material export, but we will have, processed work. And this will all turn the situation in West Virginia, which is I think it's the third poorest country of the state of the United States. So this is spreading optimism, and there is a very strong current to really straighten the world out, and it is the result of Xi Jinping, Putin, and also Trump. And these are the people who are most vilified by the Western media, which should give you to think what's wrong with these people.
And as you talk about the Asian perspective, we can also look at Europe, where there's been tremendous inroads by the Chinese in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, the Baltic states, and now Austria as well had a couple of very big conferences on the new Silk Road. And in contrast to that, we're watching the disintegration of the political parties in Western Europe. You had forecast a couple of weeks ago on the webcast here that the Jamaica Coalition, the red, green, black coalition in Germany, would fail, and it's now failed. Just contrast for us what's happening with the Chinese in Europe, and then on the other side, the implosion of the European Union.
Well, this Jamaica negotiations didn't go anywhere because none of the participating parties had anything to say in terms of content. Where should the future of Germany be, or the future of Europe? No vision, just, hick-hack about little issues, stupid issues like how quickly Germany should move out of coal, basically bankrupting the economy entirely, what was not yet accomplished through the exit from nuclear energy. They want to finish off with exiting from coal and similar things. And then naturally, the terrible discussion about should the families be allowed of the refugees to come also to Germany, rather than saying now that there is, due to the Russian intervention, peace in the Middle East possible, and how can Germany as a strong export nation participate in the reconstruction of Syria, or how can we help to develop together with China the African continent. None of such discussions took place, and instead, this thing collapsed, and now there is a big crisis because the only options left are, Grand Coalition, which Martin Schulz had refused, because, you know, the SPD got smashed in the Grand Coalition. And, you know, naturally, the perspective to continue with the Merkel policy will continue this process. Minority government is very unstable. New election is feared by many of the established parties because the trend that they would lose even more could easily continue. So there is a big crisis right now, and naturally all kinds of people are freaked out. There was just a meeting in the Italian parliament which was supposed to discuss the possible misconduct of Draghi in the 2008 crisis, and his name was not even mentioned because obviously people fear that the situation in Europe is so unstable at this point that you cannot have another scandal like that of Draghi. And the Guardian is already saying who should be the leader when Merkel goes. You know, everybody says this are the last days and last months of Merkel. So it is a big crisis because none of these established parties has any sense they're ideologically so blind and have spectacles on with which they watch the world that they don't see anything. So it is a big crisis, and therefore the Schiller Institute is going to escalate our efforts to, you know, bring the perspective of the new Silk Road into all European countries, because that is the only way how we can get to a better perspective for Germany, for Italy, for France, and all the other countries.
Helga, you mentioned the Guardian column. I mean, what the Guardian said is that it's too bad Britain has this problem with Brexit because now is the time for Britain to step in. But I think the problem has been that the British never left. Despite the Brexit, you still have the City of London's influence on the European Union. Maybe you want to say something about the new rules of the European Union on consolidating the bail-in policy. At the same time, the Chinese are coming with very strong Glass-Steagall financial regulation.
Yeah, I mean, the EU is clearly not willing to learn anything from their past mistakes. And, you know, the Damocles sword of a new credit crunch, as the Guardian puts it, you know, or better, a blowout of the system much worse than 2008 is absolutely with us. And China just reinforced its Glass-Steagall separation of the banks, and they also have a new regulatory commission basically to investigate means to shield China against the coming crash, of which they have been warning many times. So, you know, it is really up to us to escalate the campaign for Glass-Steagall in Europe, despite the EU, because if there is an emergency, I'm not so sure that, you know, things cannot then be taken back into the sovereign control of the countries when the existence of the nations are at stake. And therefore, you know, I think that the task to go for Glass-Steagall in the United States is really very, very urgent.
And there's an ongoing campaign that we're leading for the restoration of Glass-Steagall. There are bills in both the House and the Senate, and people can get involved with us in pushing the Congress and the president to finally go ahead with the step that they should have taken back in 2008. Now, Helga, the other really important story, which I think is getting very, very little coverage, is this Italian television broadcast, which included interviews with 3 people who were identified as snipers participating in the killings that occurred in the Maidan demonstrations in Ukraine in 2014. Now, this whole Ukrainian situation, which was provoked by the neocons, by NATO, by Obama, George Soros, became the excuse for the sanctions against Russia and the attempt to ice Putin out of any kind of discussions. So what do you know about these reports from the snipers and the involvement of the government of Georgia and others to destabilize Ukraine and to create this whole destabilization?
Well, this is as Professor Ivan Kachanovsky, who is one of the official investigators of the forensic evidence of the killings on the Maidan, called a bombshell. And I can only absolutely agree. 3 of the snipers who killed the people on the Maidan admitted who gave them orders. They said that it was Saakashvili's military advisor, Mamulashvili, who basically recruited them. And this Mamulashvili then later became one of the Georgian Legion leaders fighting against the pro-Russian Ukrainians in the Donbass. Then basically, that led to all the sequence of events, the coup in Kiev, the forbidding of the Russian language, then as a reaction to the Nazis practically taking over with Western backing. Remember that it was Victoria Nuland who had admitted that the US State Department of the Obama administration had spent $5 billion on the NGOs and naturally also the neo-Nazis which came in then, the Bandera forces. So this was all backed. I mean, the narrative up to the present day is that this was all caused by Russia, that Russia annexed the Crimea. And, they changed the narrative because the reality was the people of the Crimea voted in a referendum to be part of Russia because they didn't want to be under the rule of Nazis in Kiev. So the Western narrative has been entirely such to blame Putin for everything, and all the sanctions and all the anti-Russian measures are based on this narrative. And this is now blown apart by this testimony. Now, where is the Western media coverage about that? It was only Il Giornale, the Italian paper, and the Italian TV. And Handelsblatt today has a short article, which is quite typical. They say, that the Russian media, the state media, blew this story up. And, in Russia, the country of conspiracy theories, people are now saying, this was all organized by the West and Saakashvili, which it was. And then they also, however, report that Merkel was asked by a journalist if there would be an investigation of the events of the Maidan. And Merkel, in her typical way, said, yes, there will be an international investigation. Naturally, the Handelsblatt article does not mention the testimony of these 3 snipers, and the other Western media, as far as I could see before the broadcast, didn't publish anything. But this is a big story because the truth comes out if now the people who did the killing admit who hired them. I mean, this can change the whole situation, and it should, because the entire demonization of Putin is based on the narrative around Ukraine. And I think if this is being straightened out, then there is one less reason, no reason left at all, not to dramatically improve the relationship with Russia again, and really return to a peaceful cooperation as it should be, and that is now absolutely closed.
Well, I was just going to emphasize that point, Helga, because in a sense, we just had the 54th commemoration of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, where the likely real story is that there were snipers there who killed the American president, and this has been covered up for 54 years. Now, here you have a situation where you still have the people involved alive, the memory is still there, and the consequences are still underway. So if this story does get out, if people can begin to see that this was an operation run by London, by NATO, neocons, Nuland, the State Department in the United States, it does not only change the whole question of US-Russian relations, but it gives us an opportunity to really go back and make right the damage that's been done. Now, in this context, I want to come back to what we were starting with, the Russian diplomacy and then the Chinese diplomacy. It's clear that this is part of the new paradigm. And it's clear that President Putin has had a vision of this from the beginning, as does the Chinese President Xi Jinping. Where can people go to get more information on this and to become more involved in becoming an active part of bringing the West into this new paradigm?
Well, you are at the right place. You should come to the Schiller Institute, because, I feel very happy because, especially if you go back to our various websites and you read what the LaRouche movement, my husband, has been saying since the early 70s in terms of building a just new world economic order. He has published many, many books, articles. We have published an enormous amount of programs for the development of Africa, Latin America, Asia. We conducted hundreds of conferences on 5 continents. And this is our life work, which is now coming into being. Because of Chinese New Silk Road policies, all of these plans, and you can compare what we said 40 years ago, sometimes in the case of my husband, 50 years ago, and now basically the world is moving in this direction. So I'm very confident that the remaining questions like, what is freedom? What is liberty? What is happiness? These questions, will also be straightened out, because the Schiller Institute is called Schiller Institute because Schiller was called the poet of freedom. And if you look at his notion of freedom, it has absolutely nothing to do with the individualistic hedonism, what people normally call the values of the West, which are the idea that everybody can do absolutely what they please without regard for the common good or the development of future generations. This is not the freedom of Friedrich Schiller. Friedrich Schiller had the idea of freedom and necessity, of duty and passion, that you find your freedom in your necessity, and you do that by contributing to future generations, to their well-being, and that is your sense of morality. Also, the idea of happiness, it's not the hedonistic, having pleasure in the here and now at the expense of the rest of the world, just as long as you feel good. No, the pursuit of happiness, which is in the Declaration of Independence, is a notion which comes from Leibniz. It means that every person has the right to develop their potential in the fullest, to contribute to the well-being of society, and find your happiness in having such a noble mission. So I'm optimistic that the values which have gone array in the West, that because of a majority of countries moving in a completely different direction, going back to fundamental values of humanity, that this will also have a very positive effect on the West. The Leibniz at his time complained about a similar moral crisis. This was the aftermath of the 30 Years' War and the religious warfare. So he thought that Europe was in a big moral crisis then. And he had the idea to invite Chinese missionaries to teach the Europeans natural theology to make them better people. And it's almost an irony that we today are at a similar point. But I think this is actually quite fun. So there's all reason to be optimistic for the future. And given the fact that in America it's today Thanksgiving Day, I think people should reflect about the principles of the Republic, the idea of the American Constitution, the noble goals in the Declaration of Independence, and reread these things, read the proclamation of Lincoln on Thanksgiving Day, and take these values to heart and be happy.
Well, what a beautiful way to conclude this discussion. It is Thanksgiving Day, and I would encourage my fellow Americans not to overdose on turkey and football and the usual nonsense, but take the opportunity to discuss with family the ideas that you've heard presented today by Helga and the Schiller Institute. So Helga, thanks very much, and we'll see you again next week.
Yes, goodbye till next week.